before getting into the content today, I just want to say I moved into a different room just for this and the last bit of the last episode, and the reason for that was because if somebody came in and I didn't want to bother them, so I got a little room to do this recording in, and it echoes a bit. So I apologize for that, but ultimately, in this episode, we're moving on from judicial requirements and moving now into legislative requirements. And to understand the legislative requirements, we've talked about this a bit in the past, but we really need to understand federalism and how federalism works. Well, federalism refers really to the separation of powers between the state and the federal governments. Federal government, this is different from decentralization, where that decentralization just manages a federal government. But under federalism, the point is to give the federal government certain powers separate from the state, and then so that they can manage things like commerce. But the majority of powers are retained by the states. And most importantly and significantly is the police powers. And the police powers allows the state to do things that they think is appropriate to care for the health, morality, and safety of its people. But as a result, we're moving into legislative powers and how to understand them. The first one that we're going to be talking about is the Commerce Clause. The Commerce Clause is just really a regulation of both money and traffic. And we learned this from Gibbons v. Ogden. What happened in this case is that the state of New York had enacted a statute that limited who could create ferries. And the reason for this is because they wanted to encourage the use of steamboats. And so they limited it out, and Ogden was licensed, maybe it was Gibbons, one party or the other was licensed to do this in New York, to travel people from one place to another in the state of New York by this license and under the authority of New York. The other party, though, decided that they wanted to set up a competition and ultimately use this traveling over state lines. That's a key part right there, is that they traveled over state lines to determine, hey, this is, they're trying to make money, and he was doing it by federal approval instead of just New York's approval. So the other party sued him, saying, you're infringing on my license. I'm the only person who gets to establish a ferry in this area, and you're moving into my area. So he sues him, seeks for an injunction. New York gives him the injunction, and an appeal followed. And what we learn from this appeal is several things. First, navigation is commerce. Commerce is more than just money. It also includes travel. Second, Congress has the ability to regulate interstate commerce. So commerce that goes over state lines from one state into the other state, whether it's by ferry or by road, Congress has the ability to regulate that. Third, Gibbons, that was the person who had the federal license. Ogden had the state license. And so fourth, the federal power overpowers the state powers. As a result, Gibbons' license overpowers Ogden's license. And finally, now this is a different takeaway, states have the power to regulate anything that stays within their borders. So let's take an example of how this might work. California grows oranges. Florida grows oranges. Utah buys oranges. Utah can buy oranges from California, can buy oranges from Florida. The federal power has the ability to regulate some of those oranges, some of that produce, because it crosses over several state lines, interstate commerce. But however, Florida grows oranges, California grows oranges. California has the ability to regulate the oranges that stays within their state. Federal power has nothing to do with that. Florida has the ability to regulate oranges grown within their state and sold and eaten in their state. And federal power has nothing to do with that. Their final takeaway then is federal power can regulate interstate commerce, but state powers remain sole control of any powers that any materials that produce purely internal of the state. So ultimately, this is a difference again between the scope of legislative power and the scope of state powers. The one exception to this rule is going to be the police powers. For example, if a quarantine needs to happen for the health and safety, states can regulate what comes in and out of their states. And this was seen especially with COVID quarantines. Nobody really made a big deal about it because, it was COVID. But it would have been an interesting thing to see if it challenged the Commerce Clause. So, as a result, Commerce Clause really just is interpreted broadly to give the federal powers more power. And it's not surprising considering Cal Marshall, who wrote Marbury versus Madison, who established judicial review, and wrote McCulloch, where federal powers trumped state powers, would write another example of opinion that furthered federal powers even more. Have a good one. Bye. Thank you for listening to this episode of The Law Schoolers. Before I let you go, there are 4 things I want to say. The first thing is if you enjoyed these episodes and if you enjoyed the website, I would invite you to go and join Law Schoolers Pro. And you can do that by going to lawschoolers.com/join. It's a way for you to support us, but there's also a lot of features there that I think you will enjoy. Second thing is that nearly all of our episodes are unedited. The only ones that aren't are pre-law materials, and the reason for that is so you can actually see the legal material in its raw form as I'm learning it as well. The third thing is that the information contained in these episodes are specifically only for educational purposes. They're not to be used as legal advice, and with that, the fourth thing is if it is used as legal advice, we are not liable. That is, Law Schoolers is not liable for any legal outcomes. Thank you again for enjoying the show. Have a good one.